shod through this and just ramrod through it, because I want to get to the part of logic that'll be fun for you guys. And when I say fun, I mean like good. So I'm kind of using that term loosely there. But at the same time, I think it is fun too, because this is the kind of stuff, again, that you can turn around and look on, Facebook or, whatever the stuff is you play on, or look on the news, and you'll see a lot of these being committed on a daily basis. And the point of these things that I'm going to show you, they're called informal fallacies, informal logical fallacies. And so when you see these, the point is to be able to recognize a bad and or crappy argument when you hear one of these fallacies being invoked. And again, like one of the reasons that we're talking about this is because, again, our guy Aristotle, when he was, back in all right, look, a long time ago, you had the guys that were interested in the truth, right? And then you had guys who wanted to help people to be able to argue and basically, and I'm being a little general here. I'm kind of oversimplifying to some extent, but for the most part, it's generally speaking the case. So you've got guys called the sophists, and then you've got guys like Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates that were all in the same camp. Now,
hey guys, just in case you forgot, this is where I'm bringing you into the classroom with me as we talk about informal fallacies, right? Because remember, this week in logic, we're talking. We've completely shifted gears. We're going away from the formal fallacies, all the math type related rules of logic. Now we're going to the informal fallacies. This is the kind of stuff that I think you're getting a lot out of. That is a lot of fun, honestly. I think because we see the way we reason. So just in case you were like, what the hell's going on? Like I see a dude sitting there, but then that's like sounds like he's in a classroom or somewhere. Just as I mentioned in the last lecture, if you forgot, this is when I bring you into the classroom with me just to kind of break things up a bit while we discuss informal fallacies.
Now you had the sophists that would try to convince people and argue people into the belief, like a lot of the stuff that we hear now, like truth is relative, morality is relative, all these sorts of things. Those guys would argue in that camp. This is where the term sophistry comes from, right? The sophists. So you would have people, those guys that would argue those things. You had Plato, Aristotle, Socrates that would argue the opposite side. That would try to argue for some of these hardcore philosophical concepts. Now, a lot of the tactics that the sophists would use were and are very, very, very influential in regards to the public, in regards to, and I'm not saying this pejoratively, but in regards to laymen, because laymen a lot of times would have a hard time seeing through some of what now are called fallacies or fallacious missteps in reasoning. And so Aristotle was like, why is it that this stuff works so well in regards to people? And so, and again, I'm being a little simplistic here, but for the most part, this is the case. So essentially, he sits down and he says, all right, look, I've noticed that this particular tactic is used often in arguments, and it's wrong because, and he goes through it. So then he notices these guys, he notices people being swayed by this or that argument that they're giving, and he's like, that doesn't logically follow. That won't work. That's not sound. But that's a tactic that, again, is being used, and it's swaying people heavily. I'll call that this, or not necessarily he calls it this, but, it's called this. I'll name that tactic or this fallacy this. So the point of naming these fallacies, and when I say fallacy, what do I mean? Lie. Right, we're a misstep in reason, right? Like there's a misstep. Now, when we talk about this part, this is the part we're going to fly through up here, because you've got formal fallacy. Cameron, I was just about to say that you weren't here ever again. So
let me just go ahead and say too, guys, if you can't hear what the students are saying in reaction, it doesn't matter. Trust me, it doesn't matter at all. You'll still get you'll get what you need just when you hear me talking and going through the fallacies. Sometimes you may pick up what they're saying, sometimes you won't, but it won't matter at all. It's no big deal.
This right here that we're going to talk about, this is the formal stuff. So you'll have formal fallacies. And formal fallacies, again, what are fallacies? They're missteps in reasoning. So formal fallacies are going to be your like rules, so to speak, like your like technical rules of logic that are broken. Meaning like, when you make a mistake in math, if you accidentally carry the one or something like that when you're supposed to not do that, whatever the case may be. That's like an official rule, right, of mathematics. And if you break that, your answer's going to get screwed up, right? Just by virtue of you breaking a very specific formal rule of mathematics, right? Well, you can have that in philosophy too, in logic. You can have a formal rule that's broken that can almost, not always, but that can always show that your argument is wrong. But even if it doesn't show it's wrong, if you break a formal rule, it's not necessarily right. Like your conclusion is not necessarily the case. Even if it's true, it's not necessarily true if you've broken one of these formal rules, right? But what we're talking about right now are these informal rules, which are just mistakes, just lapses in reason. And this is what I'm talking about, that I want to fly through this stuff to get to that, to show you how often that you'll be able to see this stuff and use this stuff. And again, the stuff that Aristotle saw that was so just persuasive among the crowds. Why sophists were able to convince large numbers of people, and why sophists, even in our day, they're called politicians and lawyers and college professors. I'm just kidding, that's a swipe at all those three, but anyway, while a lot of those tactics are still very, very persuasive, and you'll see, you'll think, oh man, like I've probably believed half of this stuff my whole life, or maybe some conclusion based off an informal logical fallacy that really is just a complete misstep in reason. And I say that because all of us have felt prey to that, especially before you get to see, basically, quote, let's put it poetically, that the error of your ways is exposed, right, by Aristotle, something like that. So,
all right, so that was your, kind of classroom introduction to the background of this informal fallacies, how the study of informal fallacies came about. You got the sophists, you got the philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, who at least in theory were interested in truth, right? And so they started to name these informal fallacies. These are, again, mistakes in reason, right? In the reasoning process. You guys are already familiar with all the formal rules. This is the logic course. So you guys have been all through that. What you're hearing is me in an introduction to philosophy classroom, just letting them learn some informal fallacies, which we're going through from your actual textbook here. So I'm going to skip ahead. On the same slide there. I'm going to skip ahead to where we actually start to talk about that in your lecture here. So bear with me as I skip ahead to the mark where we start to talk about that here, so we can link back up together in the classroom here. About right here. About here. All right, here we go.
They're highly related because you're almost working with an equation, right? It seems like, anyway, in some sense, right? All right, now, let's get into, let me fast forward to put this stuff. Introduction to logic and blah, 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 blah. See, man, like I made this little thing. Don't you kind of feel sorry for me? That's not what that wasn't the response I was thinking that we called that. Like when I was making that, I wasn't thinking, some dude in class will think this is real cute. But hey, man, I guess that's better than you saying it's ugly. All right, switching gears. All right, so now we're going to informal logic, right? And this is the stuff, again, I think this is what you'll like here, because you'll be like, oh crap, like I've done this so many times. Or you may be like, oh yeah, I knew that. Yeah, I always knew there was something wrong with that type of response. I just couldn't put my finger on it. In fact, I didn't even know there was a name to it, but there is. So, having said as much, this is what's going to be, I think, hopefully more fun here, because you're going to get to see this stuff. All right, so I even set up here, switching gears now. See, I wrote it up there, switching gears. Informal fallacies. These deal with errors in reasoning. They're not related to the form of the syllogism. What do I mean by the form? Form is just the rules, right? Not related to the, you have an undistributed middle term, or you didn't distribute the rules. Remember the specific rules. These are just the what I said earlier about the mistakes. Like, why was Aristotle like, wait, why was it when this guy says this, why is that so persuasive? That kind of stuff. So these aren't related to like the formal rules that we didn't have time to get into. And again, you don't have to know anything about the formal rules to know about these. This is why I'm going ahead and giving you these. These are errors in thought, essentially. Remember, mistakes or a lapse in reasoning somewhere. All right, there's two basic, and don't try to write all this unless you just want to. You don't have to. I'm going to try to fly through this to get to the interesting part. There's two basic headings of informal fallacies: ambiguity and relevance. So what do you think ambiguity has to mean? Has anything to do with it? Right, so what do you mean? What do you think it means? What do you mean by ambiguous? Right, like, your terms aren't very clear, right? Something like that. Like when I say terms, like all men are mortal. Like man is a term, mortal is a term, Socrates is one of your terms. And so that's when we get into questions like, wait a minute, what do you mean by men? Do you mean like men and women? Or do you mean like strictly a man, right? Stuff like that. Like it might be unclear, like she says, just ambiguous, right? Or now, the other heading that most of these fall under is relevance. What do you think that means? That's exactly right. I mean, we had to use the same word, but I mean, that's just the way to say it. Say it again louder, Josh, so everybody can hear you. Or it's right. It's exactly right. Like, this isn't relevant, right? And you're going to be surprised at how many of these informal fallacies that you hear on a daily basis that are either ambiguous or just not relevant, even though they sound what? Right. They're going to, in fact, that's the trick behind these is they say, because anybody would, what if you were arguing, what if Marty was saying, like, I've got class after here, I got to go to math class, whatever her class is. I got to go to math class after that. And I say, you got on white tennis shoes. That's obviously what? That's obviously irrelevant, right? Like, what? That's irrelevant. But the trick is, that people are going to give these fallacies, this fallacious type of reasoning. Nobody's going to do it that way, right? Because nobody would fall for that, right? They're going to do it in a way that sounds what? Relevant, right? And this is the kind of stuff you hear in court all the time, court cases, again, from political figures, from your mom, dad, from your brothers, from your sisters, even us, even we've fallen prey to these. And hopefully, again, by seeing this, it pulls them out in the light. And it's fun to run around now saying, you can run around and say, genetic fallacy, argument ad populum, argument ad vacuum. And people go, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, nothing, just your argument doesn't follow it all. Just kidding, you won't be a jackass, but you're not going to argue that, right? All right, so ambiguity, meaning of statements is not clear, right? You said that. You guys guessed that right, or reasoned that right. Relevance, meaning it's clear, but does not address the actual issue of the argument, meaning that what you just said is completely irrelevant. Another way to say ambiguity is equivocation. Now, a fallacy of equivocation is when I mean one thing by one word, right? But then I what? Right, in a completely different way, even though it sounds like, now, an obvious example, again, you'd be more on default for this one, but it's just so obvious to make the meaning clear. Like if I were to say, well, hey, look, guys, you know that, I'm broke right now, or you're broke right now, right? Yeah, I'm broke. We know you can solve that. How? Well, there's money in banks, right? All banks have money. So if you go down the river, there's a bank, and you can get some money. So what did I do there? Right, it's this exact same word, but what? It's a completely different meaning. Now, would anybody be fooled by it? No, you have to be a goofball. Oh, yeah, riverbank. And why do I think they have money? All right, nobody would fall for that. But people don't do it that way, right? Because we're not, generally speaking, a bunch of morons, right? They do it in a more clever way. But it's the same thing. They're not really meaning the same thing. That's what happens when somebody commits that informal fallacy of equivocation. They mean something a little different, usually. If it's not a little different, it's completely different than what they're saying. I wish I could give a popular example right now, but I'm not. Because I want to fly. I want to actually get to some of these. Because I was hoping we would get to these more quickly than we did. And we'll continue these later, possibly, or probably. Now, again, accent, this is kind of a different one. And this is where stuff screws up on the internet. Like, have you ever been having a conversation on like a Facebook post or something like that, or even possibly an email, and like you're like, somebody's pissed at you or mad at you or whatever, and you're like, no, that's not what I meant by that. I mean, that can happen even in a regular talk, right? But how much more often does that happen in a text type environment? Why? And why does Right, so you don't see body language, you don't see all that, but one of the things that you really can't see is accent, right? Now, what do I mean by this right here?
What I'm writing on the board to emphasize this this fallacy of this ambiguity is I'm writing "I love you" on the board, right? And then I ask the classroom, "What is it? What do I mean by that? I love you." Well, of course, they're going to think it means one thing, but as you guys already know, it can mean different things depending on what word you accentuate, right? Like you could say "I love you," or you could say "I love you," or you could say "I love you." Right, so you'll hear that as it goes on here.
What do I mean by that? Do I? Is that really what I mean? Say that's just in text.
You could be actually sarcastic.
Right. So what if I accent this word here? Right. So if I accent this word, how does that sound? I love you. That sound has a completely different meaning than what?
Here it is.
And then if I accent this, right? I love you. That's a completely different meaning just based on which word I accent. Now, can you pick that up in a text or Facebook or whatever? You've got good context to evaluate that. But just by itself, we can make mistakes in reasoning just based off what? Just accent or emphasis. Sometimes it's called emphasis. That's not really a big one, but we had to talk about it. All right, I'm going to kind of skip through these because I want to start to get to these. All right, now fallacies of relevance. These are the more interesting fallacies. And remember, these formal fallacies are informal fallacies. Informal. Why are they informal? Why are they not formal fallacies? Right. They're not breaking the rules, right? The rules may be completely right in your argument, but there's an informal, what we would say, mistake in your reasoning. Remember, fallacies of relevance. What do these have to do with? They don't address the issue, right? That's right. Relevance, they're not relevant. So the first one is these usually have a Latin type name. Now, I think Aristotle had somewhere around 11 or 13, something like that. But they're easy to just continually make up as the centuries go by. But because again, he identified the most popular types of them, we'll just kind of concentrate, or at least center around those. Now, argumentum ad baculum, appeal to force. What do you think is an example of that?
So real quick, guys, now we're getting into these informal fallacies that you see in your book in chapter 6. All right, this is the good stuff.
How about you'll believe me or beat the freaking out of you? How about that? Like, you'll do this or you'll see the backside of my hand. Like, does that mean that my conclusion was necessarily true? No, right? Like, I'm forcing you to adopt, or trying to get you to adopt the conclusion based on what? Right. Now, that's an obvious example of something not necessarily being true, right? But what's a more subtle example? But it's the same fallacy. How about I say, guys, you'll write this on your paper, or you'll get, how about a C- for your grade today? That's an appeal to force, right? It doesn't have anything to do with the truthfulness of what you're writing or not writing in your paper, right? Like, we'll probably at some point in this class, right? And if I basically am like, look, you're going to write this way, I'm going to give you a C-, I'm sorry. What am I doing? Right, I'm just appealing to force, right? But that's the same type of argument. If I say, you don't do this, I'm going to punch you in the back of the head, right? Now, there's a difference if you get a C because your paper's crappy, right? But if it's just because I don't like it and try to get you to change it because I don't agree with it, and then I have the power to hold you accountable for that, say like with a bad grade, that's just a what? That's just an argumentum ad baculum, right? Right? Anybody want to give their own example of that maybe? Maybe even a better example? No? All right. Now, this is one of the most popular, this is what, like, there's 2 or 3 that you'll hear at least, if not on a daily basis, at least once a week, once a week. In fact, this one is so popular, it's even made its way into the common vernacular. Even a lot of people that haven't even taken philosophy know this particular argument just because they've heard it so many times, or it's so popular. So argumentum ad hominem, and that just means, again, that's slang for against the man. What's an example of that?
Scientific, like these little things that people may argue inside, and it will be like, if you're voting for Hillary, you're an idiot. Like, and that's all it says. Like, if you're voting for Hillary, you're an idiot. Like, you're just attacking the person who's not.
Right, something like that. Like, right, because that doesn't have anything to do with what? Right, and they may be an idiot, right? But they may not be voting for her because they're an idiot, right? And vice versa. Somebody may be voting for Trump. They may be an idiot, right? But they may not what? They may have some other principled reason, right? You see how it's just so popular. What's another one? What's an example we hear all the time? All right, let's pick on me. Say, my first grade philosophy class, and this guy, dude, he's not going to know anything about freedom philosophy. He talks like that. He's got a southern accent. What can he possibly know? He probably likes barbecue, fried chicken, and collard greens. What does he know?
Which is true.
What does he know about philosophy and Socrates when he sounds like we're, in high school and, home ec or something? You see what I'm saying? But what kind of argument is that? Nothing to do with my educational criteria, right? Nothing to do with what? Grade point average, my projects, nothing to do with that, right? But that stuff's persuasive. Why is that persuasive? Why is that persuasive? Now we're getting psychology, right? I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. So I don't know why it's persuasive. But it is. It's unbelievably persuasive. Is it not? Right? It shouldn't be, but is it? Yeah. Now, another one is, let's give another example, one that you might fall for, especially if you grew up, in an athletic sort of environment. Where I grew up, there's a little town not far from where I live called Mount Zion. I think there's another one here in the metro around somewhere. It's huge. I'm not talking about that one. I'm talking about this one has like 15 people and like a goat is the mayor of the town, maybe. All right, so let's say like the high school there is tiny, right? And so let's say where I grew up, where I went to high school was Carrollton. And Carrollton has just a historic, legendary football program at Carrollton. And so like the colleges used to play at Carrollton's field because it's just nicer than the colleges. That's how much stock was in the football program at Carrollton. So let's say that Carrollton needs a new head coach, right? New football head coach. They go, somebody's driving through, Bumbleville, and they go and they land in Mount Zion, and the goat greets them at the entrance. Hey! And then so let's say that they end up at the high school with 10 guys in the high school, right? And let's say that the superintendent of Carrollton says, you know what? We're giving this guy the job. And then people are like, you're giving the head coaching football job at Carrollton with 5,000 plus people in attendance every Friday night with the multi-million-dollar stadium. You're letting the head coach who's been coaching in a pasture. You're going to give that guy the head football job at Carrollton. Are you kidding me? What could he possibly know about football if he's been at that little Bumbleville, the mayor, but the mascot of the team? What would people say? Like, yeah, what do you think? What are you guys thinking? But what is that? What is that? It's just an art ad hominem, and then it's just a variation of ad hominems against the man and circumstantial. Why? Because the dude might know about what? He might be a freaking football genius, right? Right. And it is kind of an assumption, right? There's just a name for that. It's a mistake. It's a lapse in reason. And this is, again, Aristotle saw these things and gave them names. So let's say that Aristotle was sitting in Georgia, listening to this, and he's like, hey, all these people are persuaded by that. That has nothing to do with that guy's credentials. Right, that guy, if you sit down and talk to him, may what? He may he may be a football god of some sort, right? Has nothing to do with, that's just completely circumstantial. Right? What's another popular thing? What's another popular one that maybe you've even been fooled by? Because ad hominem circumstantial is around the circumstances, right? That guy's circumstances, the town he's in, the crappy football program, they play in a pasture, right? That's the circumstances. That was not specifically against him, like the one about me, like because I have an accent, right? Now, what might be another example of the circumstantial stuff? What's one you've heard? Right, yeah, and some stereotypes might fall into that, right? If you're trying to prove some conclusion, right? If you're trying to prove a certain conclusion, that might fall into it. What were you going to say, Liz?
Well, I'm definitely not certain. When people say like, oh, Trump wants to be a big president, so that the ad hominem?
If that by itself is the reason, then yeah, that's ad hominem circumstantial. Because he may be. Right now, again by itself, but if you combine that with other things, that might be a different argument. Flat out. Right, by itself, right? Because then you just disqualify who? George Washington. He's a farmer, right? So that by itself, again, like we can see counterexamples to say that doesn't necessarily follow, that doesn't logically follow, right? Something like that. But yeah, that's a good example. What's another? Does anybody have another example? Now let's go to this one very quickly. Just because this is the reason I'm really trying to get through these and we'll go is because these are your top two in the rest of these Monday. It's going to be very similar to your ad hominem circumstantial. Genetic fallacy is just to say that some conclusion is wrong because they believe it for a certain reason. Does that make sense? Remember the other day we talked about up here, like if you hold a particular belief because your mama told you that, is that a good reason in and of itself? Not necessarily, right? Why? Because other people's mamas may have told them whatever, right? Someone says, oh, the reason you're a fundamentalist Baptist is because you were raised in the South and everybody believes that. Does that mean it's false? Nope. Right? Doesn't mean it's false. It still may be true. Why? Because the reason you came to believe something has what? Nothing to do with the truth or truthfulness of the position, right? And we see how that works in reverse. Why? What if I say, oh, well, you're an atheist because you were raised by atheist parents? Genetic fallacy. It's still atheism what? It still may be true, right? Just because you were raised with a certain belief, or just because you came to a belief in the most absurd way fashion, false. No, the belief still may be true, right? So what? Right? It's just is this a fallacy of relevance? Right. It just the genetic fallacy has nothing to do with the relevance. Or let's say that someone says that, for instance, okay, look, what is cellular biology based on now? Roughly the model of who? A monk who had a vision of a reptile eating itself in a snake, right? That's how he came up with the basic idea of those biological cellular structures, right? But what are they still? They're true. Even though what got him started on that was a nutbag crazy dream. It's true. It's still true, right? Because that has nothing to do with whether the position is true or false. So you'll hear politicians, all the time. Oh, my opponent believes this because of blah, 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 blah. Well, that means the position's false. The point is this. You've got to address what? The argument, right? Whatever somebody's espousing, whatever their belief system is, whatever they're trying to get across, whatever the guy wants to be a football coach from wherever, you've got to address what? The reason that we want to point these fallacies out is because all fallacies are what? Distractions away from what? The real issue is the issue. So, for instance, we talk about God's existence. The issue is what? Does God exist, right? It doesn't matter if uneducated people believe in God or educated people believe in God. It doesn't matter if uneducated people are atheists or educated people are atheists, right? What kind of fallacy is that? It's irrelevant, right? And so this is true in any regard, whatever someone's political position is. Is what you're saying, are you committing a genetic fallacy? Are you committing an ad hominem type fallacy? Or are you addressing the issue on the merits of what? The issue, right? Almost no one, this is why this stuff is so rhetorically powerful, because it's easier to attack the person, attack the circumstance, attack the person's background, attack the person's whatever, than actually attack what? That's right. So let's go on this. It's actually easier to do that. It's easier to go after that than to go after what? The argument. All right, so let's continue this next time.
All right, guys. So that class ended, but obviously we didn't. So we're going to go ahead and skip forward to where we pick this back up again in the next class. And also, I hope that you're enjoying, just this kind of break up the monotony of me sitting here, and you kind of get a different taste of what's going on, or not different taste of what's going on, but just kind of a different mode to get the same stuff that's going on. So here we go. You guys. What if someone said, let's use another controversial example, but I mean, not like as controversial, but what if someone says, well, you believe that because you watch CNN all day long? Well, that may be why you believe it, right? But if the implication is it's false, that's the example of what? Genetic fallacy, because you may hate CNN, right? But they still can tell the truth about whatever that particular thing is, right? You'd have to see that for other reasons. Again, the flip side. Well, yeah, the reason you believe that is because you watch Fox News all day long. Right. So what could happen? Still be true, right? Just because Fox News said it, what? Right? I mean, it's false. It could still be true, right? You have to what? Judge the issue for what? Right. You have to judge the issue on its own merit, right? You have to look at the reasons for or against it. If you hold all your beliefs because some talking head on Fox News says something, they could still be true, right? If you hold your beliefs because some talking head on CNN says something, they can still be what? They can still be true. Right? See, these are examples you'll see every day. I hear college professors say it all the time. Hey, man, you need to turn it off, whatever news channel, and watch this, and then maybe you wouldn't be such an idiot, or maybe you wouldn't believe all that stuff. Like genetic fallacy. It's irrelevant, right? Again, because what are these fallacies? What did we just say? They're what? The word I just used. Right. Distractions, they're irrelevant. Irrelevant.
It's irrelevant, but that stuff passes as persuasive in our culture, right? Even among the intelligentsia, right? Right. So you have to at least look at, is there a reason for it to be right in that sense, right? Now, that's actually another informal fallacy called cliche. Why is that a fallacy? We'll just go ahead and skip to that one. Why is it a fallacy to use a cliche to prove an argument? What's that? Well, no, not necessarily because they're always used. There's almost always what in regards to cliches? A counter cliche, right? So what if someone says, hey man, you ought to do this. Why should I do it? Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Or what if he asks the next guy, hey man, why should I do this? Says, hey, I wouldn't do it. Better safe than sorry. You see what I'm saying? Those are two exactly opposite cliches that say the exact same thing to the same guy in the same situation, but they imply the same thing. One says do it, one says don't do it, right? So you can't use a cliche, what? To prove an argument, right? You have to use what to prove an argument? Reasons, right? You have to give reasons, right? So we'll skip cliche when we get there. All right, so tu quoque, this is also another one you'll hear all the time. Tu quoque is just roughly Latin for YouTube, right? Not the band YouTube, but like as in like also, right? So you also. Now, what do you think an example of this fallacy would be? You hear this. It's so easy to use these on like religion and politics because these are just the topics you hear them almost all the time used on and in regard to. So what's an example of you also fallacy? What's an example?
It's essentially the hypocrite fallacy, right? What do I mean by that? You too, you also. What do I mean by that? This is my wife's favorite fallacy. What do I mean? What's the, we'll just call it, so you understand it better, the hypocrite fallacy. What is an example of that? Or saying that they don't do what? They don't do it, right? So let's say I'm like, all right, look guys, for the state of your family, for the state of your kids, it's really best to be, stay with their biological mom or dad, something like that. I'm like, hey, haven't you been married 6 times? Well, yeah. Well, then I don't want to listen to you then. Now, why is that fallacious? Doesn't mean I'm wrong. It just means that I'm what? A hypocrite. It means I can't live up to my own standard, right? But it doesn't mean what? What doesn't follow?
Your father's not the best person here.
Right. That's exactly right. It may hurt my credibility, but what? It doesn't mean you're wrong, right? So, in fact, I was watching watching CNN one day, and I was watching these 2 guys go at it. And the guy says, what is this guy arguing? He's arguing something like that, like men should, treat their wives with respect or whatever, this kind of thing, stay with them, even when it gets tough, something like that. Well, then the host says, look, essentially what I just said, he said, don't you think, that it's ridiculous for you to sit here and say that when, and then he brought up his past or something. And the guy said, I won't tell you what the guy said yet because it was a brilliant example to completely turn the tables. But before we say that, he basically tried to discredit his conclusion how? By showing what? Okay, right? You too, you've done this. Well, it doesn't mean he's false, right? It doesn't mean what he's saying is false. It just means that he's whatever. Well, instead of the guy, obviously he probably hasn't had a philosophy course, but he could think straight. So the first thing he said in response was just ingenious. The guy says, you shouldn't be saying that because you, blah, 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 blah. Well, then the guy said to the host, the news anchor guy, he said, well, wait a minute. He said, don't you tell everyone all the time, haven't you started these organizations to kick kids off the streets and not be in gangs and whatever? And the guy was like, yeah. And he said, weren't you in a gang? And the guy was like, well, yeah. He's like, right. So just because you were in a gang doesn't mean that the fact that what you're saying now about kids not being in gangs is what? False. It just means that you screwed up too, right? Now, like Piper said, it may hurt your credibility, right? But it doesn't mean that what? That what you're saying is wrong or false. Right? By the way, I haven't been married 6 times. We're going to say something, Jay.
Well, doesn't it kind of depend upon the age of the thing?
What the student's saying in the background right now is she's trying to say that doesn't it give you more credibility because you're doing that too, right? You're performing the behavior too, so it gives you more credibility to speak against it. So I just wanted to know what she was kind of trying to say, and I'll address that.
So the game is something if they were trying to
Hang on, guys. I'm having a hard time hearing you tell you back here. Sorry, go ahead again.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so I said that would that be the best way to see knowledge process depending upon the
Possibly. So you're saying that if you've experienced something, then that gives you more credibility in a sense to say, like, look, I've experienced this, so don't do it because I went through it and it screwed my life up, something like that. Right, and that may be true, but the 2 fallacy really has more to do with because that's debatable, right? Even that's debatable. Maybe it gives you a leg up, in offering advice. Maybe it doesn't. But really, this fallacy is really more like you're still doing it right now.
Oh.
Right. So really, the more applicable situation would be, let's say, right now, I'm lecturing you on being faithful to your spouse or whatever, and I'm being unfaithful to my spouse right now. And they're like, dude, I saw you last night, with Shalandra over here, and you're telling me right now to be with my right. So now, does that completely does that mess up my credibility in what I'm saying? Yeah, sure it does, absolutely. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that I'm what? Right, I still could be right. Because, again, what did that fallacy do? It diverted the issue, the attention away from the issue and put it upon me or whatever I'm doing wrong or whatever I'm screwed up with. It doesn't have anything to do with what? The issue. The issue has to be judged on what? Its own merits. Remember, that's when we go through all these fallacies, all of these are pushing pushing the attention away from the issue at hand, right? Now, you see why these are so powerful. Remember, before we started talking about these, we were like, yeah, probably in your mind, like, I probably don't do any of this stuff. But we do every one of these things, right? We've dismissed conclusions that people are trying to offer based on what? Fallacious styles of reasoning. We've committed genetic fallacy, or we've seen genetic fallacy committed. We've seen ad hominems probably on a daily basis. We see this on a daily basis, right? Because you have to say like, well, no, they're not a hypocrite.
No, you can say, no, they're a hypocrite. But what they're saying may still what? It's still may be right. Right? Something like that. Now, this is one of my favorite. Argumentum ad ignorantium. It means just from ignorance. So, what do you think an example of this is? An argument from ignorance. Go ahead, Piper.
It's like people who say they see UFOs where they don't know what it is, but then they go, therefore it's aliens from outer space, because what's the other possible?
Well, let's make it a little more clear. But you're not wrong there. But let's make it a little more clear. It's like saying this. It's like saying hey, Karina, have you ever proved there's no UFOs? So then they're probably UFOs then.
Okay.
Right? That's an argument from ignorance. Like you can't draw a conclusion from nothing. That's why I like how this guy says it here. Ignorance proves nothing, and all that can be concluded from nothing is what? Nothing. Right? You can't use it in ignorance. You can't appeal to what you don't know and then to prove something, because what is not knowing? What does that prove? If you're using this, which I just grabbed what? Nothing. I can't use it to prove what? I don't have anything, right? But people do it all the time, right? Right? Now, you can see this again. Let's go back to controversial subjects. Can you prove that God doesn't exist? Can you prove there's no God? Well, then I'll say there must be a God. That's an argument from ignorance. It's a terrible argument. Now, you can do the opposite. Can you prove right now to me that there's a God? Right now, can you show me that? Well, no. Well, then there's not a God. Argument. Both of those are what? I've seen both sides use that argument. Terrible argument. Why? Because again, all that can be concluded from nothing is what? Nothing. Now, again, you see how those are persuasive, though? And like, it seems the brilliance of Aristotle, like, that's a misstep. No, that's a misstep. And then names them. Right, this stuff's used so often and was used so often that Aristotle could say, no. And then names them so that now you got a little tool bag, and somebody does this stuff, you're like, oh, this is argument from ignorance here. There you go. Use this. But you see where this stuff what's another example from an argument from ignorance? Guys, I know y'all know this stuff. Don't make me take my shoes off. That's a non sequitur, right? That's irrelevant. All right. Argument from silence. What's an argument from silence?
I'm about to sing here, I think. So get ready.
Argument from silence.
Told you.
What is one? What? All right, what's somebody saying?
I don't know what it is.
Argument from silence.
Even that one got me.
I mean, it's funny. I think it's kind of self-explanatory.
It's one of those where you say something so stupid, the whole room just looks at you and stares.
No, it's not that.
You argue about one, and then the other person that you're arguing with is something, and it's kind of like you just talk to yourself.
No, that's a good guess. Go ahead.
Isn't that where the person with the response, you already assume what they're saying, and they're saying nothing at all?
No, that's what you saying. That's what she was saying right there. That's a good guess. But argument from silence is when you try to say something like, I'm trying to give it a good example. I've got a couple, but I don't think they're really that good. Let's see. It's kind of like argument from ignorance. So imagine this. Let's say that I talk about my 3 girls, right? I've got 3 little girls. Well, then you go outside and you're talking about, well, Mr. Crawford's talking about his kids or whatever, and he doesn't have a son. And you're like, why do you know that? Well, because he's talking about his 3 girls in there. And you say, well, because he didn't mention a son, so he doesn't have one. Right? And he said it's an argument from silence. Because just because I didn't say anything about having a son doesn't mean what? Right, it doesn't mean I don't have one. Right? What's another example?
Like you talk about pets, it's just like having a cat, and like, oh, she don't have a dog.
Right. Right. Are they going out and telling everybody like so and so, he doesn't like dogs or he doesn't have a dog? Like, well, how do you know? Because it's not a sign on the issue. But again, just kind of like arguing for ignorance. Well, there's nothing there.
So right. Inference from lack.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. So it's like a bad inference. Now, there's an exception to this. There's called a strong silence. What do you think I might mean by that?
They freak
No, what? Strong silence. What do you think I mean by that? Or how might that be an exception? Now, or look, what if you said, Mr. Crawford, will you please, let's say we're talking about my kids again, all right, will you please, tell us about your familial background or something like that, or your family. And then so I'm like, all right, I have some children. My children are Lily Rain, Lyle Spring, and right, those are my kids, all right? And then so I start to talk about my wife. Now, I didn't mention anything about a son, right? Now, say you go and say you write this down, say you had to write this down for whatever your class notes. And then you go and talk about, Russ's kids, and you're like, well, he doesn't have a son. Now, strictly speaking, is that argument from silence? Strictly speaking, yes, but that's a strong silence. Why? Well, no, because you asked me to label out my kids. I write them down, right? I write them down, which is probably pretty indicative of what? That I probably don't have what? A son, right? Now, logically, could there possibly still be that possibility? Sure. But that's an argument for strong silence. So if I'm up here talking about my kids, I write my kids down, names down, and literally put numbers beside their name, like, you can probably infer that I don't have a son based on it, right? Now, actually, an example is pretty funny. Again, we'll use this because we're in the Bible Belt. Every once in a while, you'll get breaking news that comes out about something about, Jesus of Nazareth or whatever. Well, there's an example of one where they talk about Jesus being married. Well, if you're familiar with any of the New Testament passages, any of the New Testament text, there's a passage in, I believe it's Corinthians, where Paul, the Apostle Paul, lists out reasons why they should be able to be married, something like that. Because somebody's, giving them a hard time, they can be married or not married. Well, he lists out these reasons as to why, essentially this, long story short, this is what scholars have used in these debates back and forth. So you'll see where Paul lists out that the apostles have wives, right? So he says, why should the apostles, the disciples, the guys that follow Jesus, why should they be allowed to have wives? And then you're going to get mad at me for not saying I can't have a wife, whatever the case may be. Well, he's trying to justify that it's okay to have a wife, right? For a follower of Jesus to have a wife. That's what he's trying to justify here, or the disciples of Jesus to have wives. He's trying to justify that. So he talks about all the disciples of Jesus that have these wives, but then he doesn't list two. Right. Now, is that an argument from silence? Could Jesus have had a wife? Logically speaking, yes, right? Because he doesn't list him. But that would be an example of a strong silence. Why? Well, if he's trying to prove that he's okay in having a wife, and he's listing out these disciple guys that followed this Jesus guy around as having wives, well, wouldn't it have been conducive to him just to say, oh, and by the way, Jesus had a wife? That would have been conducive for him to say that, right? Now, strictly speaking, is that an argument from silence? Could it logically be possible? Logically speaking, Jesus had a wife. Yeah, it's an argument from silence. But they would say it's a what? Strong silence, right? Something like that. Anyway, that's just probably one of the best examples, or the easiest you can give, being where we live now in our culture. Fallacies of relevance. Argumentum ad misericordiam. Now, again, you do this all the time. What do you think misericordiam means? Remember, most of this is Latin. Yes, it means Latin. Argumentum ad Latin. Misericordiam means, where do you think the word misery comes from? Right, misery, right? Misericordiam. So it's an appeal to pity. What might an example of that be? What might be an appeal to pity? Right, therefore what? So if one of my students were to say, Mr. Crawford, last night, I was watching Leno, and my mom came in there and she punched me in the face, and blah blah. Anyway, that's why I didn't get this work done. And if you give me a 0, then I'll fail this course. Does that have anything to do with what? Right, it doesn't have anything to do with that, right? That's an appeal to pity. It doesn't follow that because of those things happen, that your grade should be a different thing, right? Or think of it this way. Judge, if we convict this man, who's going to raise his children? If you see him convict this man of this particular crime, and his wife and his kids and blah, 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 does that have anything to do with whether he did what he did or did not do what he did? Now, should that be taken into consideration? Possibly, right? But that has no bearing as to what? His actual innocence or his actual what? Guilt. It's irrelevant to whether he's innocent or guilty. Should it be taken into consideration? Possibly. But go ahead.
So with the broad term, case be like an example, like the young,
Remind me of that. Oh, yeah, the swimmer guy.
he's the James,
Right, it's-
race girl, like, dumpster, and he got like only 6.
She's giving an example about this was cases a while back when some swimmer, some famous swimmer at some prestigious university was accused of a very significant wrongdoing. And I think, if I recall correctly, the evidence was that he did. And part of the defense was, hey, you'll ruin this guy's life if you convict him of this crime. That's what she's talking about.
6 months because they're like, oh, he's rich and he's privileged and he won't be well in prison. So like he got like a way towards his sentence because they made it seem like, oh, this is a little guy, you know, he don't hold himself together.
No, that's not even what the word it is. His father said for 20 minutes. For 20 minutes of fun. Go to jail for years.
Right. Now, I don't know the details on that case, so I'm not going to remark as to what his guilt or innocence. Why? Because I don't know. You know, I don't know. I don't know what he did or didn't do. Now, obviously, I think we can all agree if someone rapes somebody, he deserves to be punished. I mean, that should be a given, right? At least in our culture, we don't live in the Middle East where that's debatable. But anyway, that's another reason somewhere I'll probably get fired. But I think we can all agree if someone rapes somebody, that's heinous, right? Now, so don't get me wrong when I'm saying I'm not remarking on that because I don't think that. I just don't know. You know, I don't know the facts. But if someone were trying to argue that, well, you know, his career or his life will be ruined or whatever, should that be taken into consideration? Possibly. But does that have anything to do with his guilt or innocence? No, it doesn't have anything to do with it, right? That's an appeal to pity, right? Does that have anything to do with the guilt or innocence of the crime? By the way, let's just side note here. Does the duration of a crime have anything to do with the guilt of a crime? So, if, like Piper said, you know, this 20 minutes shouldn't reflect his entire life or whatever. If he did 20 minutes of this crime, whatever, that shouldn't be. He shouldn't pay for that for 20 years or whatever the case may be. Does time have anything to do with? Does the duration of time have anything to do with crime?
Well, not necessarily.
What's that?
It's like you're basically in trouble for whatever.
Or should it have anything to do with punishment? The extension of a punishment. Should the duration that it took you to commit a crime should have anything to do with the duration of your punishment? What's that? It shouldn't, right? Why? How long does it take to murder someone?
Well, some people drag it out.
Right. But in principle, it can easily be done with what? In less than a second, right? So should your punishment be less than a second? Well, that doesn't seem to follow, right? Now, remember that when we get, in a couple of weeks, we get something that's going to be huge. Because if you think that that's a viable principle, that punishment shouldn't necessarily have anything to do with time, then that's probably going to bite you in the butt about 3 or 4 weeks when we get down to a different argument. Because you won't realize it, but you'll want to jump to that, even though you've already conceded that probably should be used. All right, so anyway, appeal to pity, let's go ahead and get that one. Now, this is an awesome one too. Argumentum ad populum. What's this one?
Really good one, guys. Pay attention.
Now, this is going to be distinguished from argument of consensus gentium, which is argument of the majority. This is going to be argumentum ad populum, which means it has to do with more with like a popular type trend. What's an example of this? Or if someone appeals to that for the reason that you should take it, right? Look, man, everybody in our college is holding this particular position, right? It could be that, but in real life, it could be something more. Let's make it more realistic and controversial. Let's make it realistic. Everybody in this college that has anything to do with current events is supporting this particular stance on blah blah blah. So, I'll give the rats a right. It doesn't matter. The issue is what? The issue is the issue. What are your reasons for the issue for holding that stance, right? Or what are your reasons against holding that stance? Like, it doesn't matter if everybody in this classroom holds to that particular position, you know, if it's popular within your society, it's irrelevant. Again, that's irrelevant as to the truth of that particular position. And see, this is the one that everybody thinks they're free up from, and almost everybody's a slave to this right here. Right? Think about whatever your particular position is right now that you're like your favorite little position that you're holding, and think about how popular that may be right now in our society. Now go back to 1830 and say, all right, your position, look, nobody holds that right now. So that can't possibly be a reason as to give why you should hold that position, right? Because in one period of time, it may not be popular, and in one period of time, it may be very popular, right? Think of an example of that. What's an example of that? What's an example of that? Go ahead.
I don't know, like saying that pot should be legalized, they could, I don't know, 1950 you could say that. It's like,
Right, well, they can say nobody believes that. So is that by itself, that has to be an invalid reason for using to prove your argument, right? Or think about slavery, right? Why do you not hold slaves? Nobody does that. What kind of idiot would do? Nobody does that. That's just an appeal. That's just an argument that's popular. That's not a good reason to not hold slaves, right? Why? Because you could use that in 1830 to support what? Slavery. You go back to 1830, you could say, why should I not hold slaves? Everybody holds slaves. Like, what kind of idiot would believe not to do that? Like, we all do this. Like, what do you do? Like, you see what I'm saying? You can't appeal to the popular trend to support your position because obviously just one example that we've seen, you could show this to be wrong in all kinds of ways, but just one example is just, all right, go to a different time period and try to do that with that particular position, right? All right, let's make it controversial. Let's say that you're, what's a good one? What's a cultural hot button? Oh, here's two good ones. Let's use same-sex marriage. Let's say someone says, why do you not support same-sex marriage? Everybody at this entire university that has half of a college degree realizes that you should support same-sex marriage. That's an argument I'm popular on. It's irrelevant. Terrible argument, right? Why? Again, go back to 1830. You should support the traditional stance on marriage. Look around. Everybody supports everybody that's graduated from every Ivy League institution supports the traditional stance on marriage in 1830. Who are you to sit here and say that you shouldn't support that? See how they can appeal to the popular majority, right? Just like you can appeal to the popular majority now, right? So if you support or don't support that stance, that better not be your reason. I say crappy reason why. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant what the popular trend in your society is. You have to have a different argument, right? In fact, you have to have what? An actual argument, right? Appealing to the popular trend is, as we say in the South, piss poor, right? It's one word. That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. You have to have arguments, right? You have to have reasons. See, again, do you see the brilliance of Aristotle? Remember, he just sat there and noticed all these things. Nothing new under the sun, right? I mean, think about it. 2,500 years ago, this guy's pointing out stuff that people are still doing, using. Because they work. Crappy lines of reasoning, what? Unfortunately, what? Work. Consensus gentium. Now, this is very similar to argument ad populum, or argument, to the masses kind of thing. This is very similar to that. This is the appeal to the majority. Now, how is this similar, first and foremost? How is it similar to the one we just talked about? You're appealing to some big group outside of yourself, right? Now, the other has more to do with what? As you two were just saying.
The majority of people.
Right. The other may not necessarily be a majority, right? It just may be widely popular, maybe a very popular trend, but it still may not be the majority opinion, right? Now, consensus gentium just is what? The actual majority. Well, now, what are some examples of that? We could even go back to our other example, right? We could just say, let's imagine the majority of the population believes one way or the other. You still can't use that for what? Right. You still can't use that for your argument, right? Because why? You can just go back in time and try to use the same argument, see if it supports the exact opposite conclusion, right? And if your argument supports contradictory positions, if your argument supports the exact opposite conclusion at a different time and place, then that's a really bad argument, right? In fact, it's not even an argument, it's a fallacy, right? What might be another example of this besides the ones we already talked about?
It would be like you're an atheist and you stumble into a church or something, and all these other people, like in church, like you God, why should I believe in God?
Yeah, I mean, so right. So or you don't have to be in the church. You could just say, strictly speaking, the world, right? So 90-something% of the population believes in God, right? You don't even have to be in the church. 90-something% of the world's population believes in God. So if you were to say, you need to believe in God, why do I should believe in God? Because 90-something% of the world's population believes in God. Right? That's in consensus gentium, right? Now, why is that a terrible argument? Right. Well, let's go to the year 2160. Let's say that particular time, let's say atheism is dominant as far as the belief system goes. And what if someone says, why should I be an atheist? And they say, because 99% of this world population doesn't believe in God. You just prove the exact opposite of your conclusion earlier, right? With the exact same argument. Well, argument there in parentheses is fallacy. It won't work, right? You have to have what? You have to have reasons as to why you shouldn't believe in God, right? Or you should have reasons as to why what? You should believe in God, right? Do we use these things all the time? Do you see society use this kind of stuff all the time, right? In fact, well, we'll get to that. Appeal to authority. Sweet Moses, this is probably the worst one, or the one that makes me the most mad, because this comes across as the most quote unquote intellectual type of objection, even though it's just as fallacious as any other type of objection. What's an example of this? Go ahead.
Like you're referencing an article on Galileo, and it's like a scholarly article, and it's so like it's still going to be wrong, even if you have like all of these like educated people writing it together.
Well,
it looks good.
Well, possibly. That's why I said I draw a distinction between the above and a false and appropriate authority. So if you have an appeal to authority, I would say really what you're really looking for is an appeal to an inappropriate authority.
Okay.
So why would I say? So what do I mean by that?
I'm a dietitian, not an MD.
Right, or even worse. Like, what if I'm sitting here talking about, let's get a hot button cultural issue examples. Because they're just easy, right? Everybody has an opinion on them, and they just instantly rile you up, right? So let's use those. Who remembers Bill Nye the Science Guy? Right, I do. Right, he seems like an intelligent individual, right? I mean, he is, right? But then he gets on the internet and starts making arguments, or not arguments, but basically what? Not arguments, but he starts saying stuff against what position? His degree is, he's an engineer, right? He's got to be a bachelor's in engineering. So, he may have a master's in engineering too. So.
They have like
He does have
PhD.
Right, but he gets on popular like channels and what argues what? One of them he argues particularly against saying the abortion issue, right? And then so people quote Bill Nye as if he's an authority on what? That's an inappropriate appeal to authority. It doesn't matter what Bill Nye thinks, right? Now again, like whatever your particular stance is on the abortion issue, you probably should use as your sources and your citations for your argument who? Right, biologists or philosophers who deal with that particular issue, right? Now, would it be the genetic fallacy to say Bill Nye's wrong? Yeah, right, because he may be right, but you can't quote him as your what? Right, because that's not his field, right? So these are usually easy issues to talk about because they're just so easily recognizable. So when someone, say, quotes Einstein in relation to certain beliefs on God or not, Einstein's not a philosopher or theologian. What is he? Right, yeah. Or a theoretical physicist or something like that, right? He deals with it's his field, the study of philosophy, religion, and theology. No. So if you're trying to prove some argument in regard to God's existence, because I've seen both sides use Einstein, if you're trying to use Einstein for your side, you're doing this right here. It's an appeal to an inappropriate authority. Now, again, is he wrong because he's not a philosopher of religion or a theologian? Maybe or maybe not, but that's not who you quote what? To prove your case. Because basically, you're just trying to ride the coattails of his credentials, right? Well, Einstein says, so? Right? What are his arguments? Right? Yeah, that would be the worst example of, yeah, it is. No, I don't mean your worst example. I'm saying like that would be like the bottom of the barrel of somebody trying to say, well, Wikipedia says, right? So if someone's, I'm just trying to understand. So if someone were to say, to make what you're saying right, if someone were to say, well, Wikipedia says, blah, 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 right?
not anymore.
Wikipedia is still really bad. I get so frustrated reading Wikipedia stuff.
You've never seen an edit point of the pages that it goes through?
Dude, I have an account where I can get on Wikipedia and edit stuff. And then I can edit stuff on Wikipedia and put in what I know is 100% right information on that particular issue. I'll go back a week later, someone has re-edited my edits, and you're just like, this place is good. Right, you can roll back previous edits.
All right, so right now you're hearing some little tangent on Wikipedia. Don't worry about any of that.
I was in 8th grade one time and updated.
One time. Hopefully one time.
One time.
I was in eighth grade 3 consecutive school years.
8th grade, this is before they had page locks. I edited the entire intro for Space, to say that it was founded by Del Jackson.
If I can
It
fast
was up there
forward
for
that.
like 3 weeks before somebody voted.
Now there's probably somebody running around quoting what Wikipedia says. What's another example of this? Let's say my little girl helped her with her math homework last night. And let's say she goes back to school and the teacher says, number 5 is wrong. And she says, my dad teaches college courses. He is very, very smart. Number 5 is not wrong. Well, it's a math problem, right? Like, because I teach philosophy to college folks, that doesn't mean that I'm also what? A math genius, right? Now, does that mean I'm wrong? No, I still could be right, but she can't appeal to her dad, the philosophy teacher, who she thinks very intelligent, in order to do what? Math problems, right? I'm out of my field. That's not my discipline, right? Now, hopefully I'm not going to miss a first grade math problem. But you see how that would be an inappropriate appeal to authority, right? Now, this is a good one. Argumentum ab annis. I won't say it that way. Chronological snobbery. What's a good argument on? What's a good example of this one? You're on the right track, but that's not necessarily it. That would be more of an argument ad hominem, right? Because you're talking about their specific age. What's argumentum ad annis because of age? Chronological. What does chronological mean? Well, what type of order? Like time, right? Because you can have
In order of what happened.
because you can have a logical order that's not necessarily chronological, right? Chronological order has to do with what? Time, right? Not necessarily just order and time. So let's go back to our earlier example, because these are just the easy ones. Dude, you can't possibly hold to that stance of marriage, so the traditional stance. That's so Victorian. That's so post 18th century.
Like the.
Chronological snobbery.
It's the age is the point itself, maybe.
Right. It's so right. If you're basically trying to say that it's the 21st century, man. Right. Get with the times. It's 21st. Who holds that view? That's what? Chronological snobbery. Like the times have nothing to do with what? The issue. Right? It's completely what? Irrelevant. Right? Because again, you could just do the reverse, right? You could do the reverse. Get with the times, man. Everybody has slaves. It's the 18th century. Everybody owns people. Right? Right? So you can't use that to appeal to but notice how everyone does this in what? Right, in their own time, but everybody sees it as stupid to have done then, but what do they do now? It's the 21st century, man. You got to let people love who they want to love. That's irrelevant. Now, you may believe that, which is fine, right? But you have to what? Have an argument for that position, right? It's the 21st century, man, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter if it's the freaking 13th century. The issue is what? The issue is the issue, right? Whatever your stance is on, say, any of those cultural hot button topics, you have to have what? Arguments and reasons, right? But we see how it's easy. Is it already that time? We see how it's easy to what? Just to appeal to what? Fallacious types of reasons, age being one of them. It's just irrelevant. You're an idiot. I'm just kidding. You're not an idiot, but you're making what?
Idiotic.
Right, idiot type. Right, there you go. That's a better way to say it. I was going to say idiotic type of arguments. You just simplify it. Simplify it's not even a word. Argumentum ad futurus, to the future. Now, again, I've seen both sides of it's so fun just to talk about the God thing, because these are, again, they're just always so easy right off the bat to see how people use these on both sides. What is an argumentum ad futurus? To the future. Appeal to the future. What are arguments? What's an example of this? What's that? Not necessarily. Because that should be a valid concern, right? No, it doesn't matter.
Jump on the bandwagon, or listen to me because in a couple of years,
You're on the right track. So here's how both sides use this argument right here. Here's how both sides of the God debate question use this argument. Which one do you want to hear first? The bad God side or the bad atheistic side? Which one do you hear first?
This is like say someone believes in God, they're like, oh yeah, well you don't believe in God, if you die and you wake up in hell, you don't believe in God, like saying future, and then like they would say like, well, what do you do wrong?
Her argument's
You
also
die
don't
and
worry.
nothing or something.
Almost. You got the God side pretty much right, but not the atheist side. So the God side would be something like, you don't believe in God? No, I don't believe in God. Well, then you just wait till Jesus shows up. Wait till the rapture, see what happens. Right? Now, which may or may not be true, but that can't possibly be what? You can't use it for your argument, because all you can use for your argument is what? what we have right now, the evidence that we have right now, you can't appeal to the future, right? Now, what's the bad side of that? The atheistic side of that. Wait till the devil shows up. No, because they would be admitting that what? The devil's real, and probably can't be an atheist, right? What's that? Right, yeah, but what I thought does anybody know what the atheist side of that same argument might be? What's the atheistic side of that same argument? At least one version of that. Well, I don't care that your aunt so-and-so was completely 100%, paralyzed, and then somebody prayed and she was healed instantly. Just wait. One day science will show why that happened. Argument to the future. You have to go with what? What's that?
People are say things like that.
Oh, yeah. People say all the time. You'll hear a more sophisticated version of that. It'll say something like, science has always shown us where theology thought they had this. Science has always come along and shown us it was really not theology. It was really not God. It was just science. So just wait, and science will figure that out too.
Well, some people also said the opposite, which is because science changes so often, therefore don't trust science.
Oh, well, that's not the opposite, because one is an appeal to the future. One is just a what? One just tries to pull a carpet out from under the methodology of science itself, right? So the reverse of that would be, well, you just wait till Jesus shows up, right? And then the opposite side of that is you basically just wait till science shows up, right? Does that make sense? You have to go with what you have right now for the evidence. You can't appeal to the future. One is called God of the gaps. One is called science of the gaps, right? You have to stay right here and look at what the evidence is right now. You can't constantly appeal to the future, hoping that the future will prove your position. Because when all the data comes in the future, it may what? It may prove your position what? Position what? Wrong, right? So you can't appeal to the future to support your position. In a way, that's kind of like ignorance, right? So kind of like appeal to ignorance. You can't appeal to what we don't necessarily know yet. You have to appeal to what we do know. Well, right. In one sense, in one way, it kind of just begs the question that you're already right, right? Well, that's what you're trying to prove right now, that you are right. When you say when you're appealing to the future, you're just assuming that you are. But that's what we're trying to prove right now, right? Which perfectly goes into this begging the question, which is just a circular argument. What is a circular argument? Like we said, in a way, that sort of is in a way, right? Because you're just assuming, in a way, that you're already right and you're appealing to the future, saying the future will support you. Well, you don't know that. That's what we're trying to prove right now. Now, but Petitio Principii really is a circular argument begging the question a little bit different. What's the terrible God side of the version of this? All right.
That's God's real because it's in the Bible, and the Bible's right because God wrote it.
Yeah.
Right. Or let's do it a little more understandable. The Bible is the Word of God. How do you know the Bible is the Word of God? Because it says it is. That's a circular argument, right? Now, does that mean that the Bible is not the Word of God? Maybe or maybe not. But that is the worst argument ever, right? Because why? What could someone else do? No, the Quran is the Word of God. Why do you know that? Because the Quran says it is, right? Well, now how do you judge between the two? You can't, right? It's just assuming what it's trying to prove, right? It just assumes what it's trying to prove. Now, what is another example of that? A begging question, circular argument. I'll give you another example. Besides that, think of one. Begging the question.
Busted the song again.
Circular argument.
And again.
What was the one we were saying earlier? That we were singing, we could put those two choruses together. Yeah, I'm gonna bring my drum. One day I'm gonna bring my drums and my guitar to class.
Are you actually going to want to carry all that in? Yeah, I would too. Yeah, if you really wanted to do it. You probably get straight up.
Circular argument. What's another example of circular argument? It's in my nursery, baby nursery. My wife's mad about it. What's another example of a circular argument? Oh, I know one that we can talk about. To be fair to both sides, if the bad circular argument on the theistic side, the God side is the whole. I know the Bible's the Word of God because the Bible says it's the Word of God. That's a terrible argument. Don't use it. The reverse of that, on the other side, would be something like going off what we were saying earlier about somebody being paralyzed or whatever. Would be to say like a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and we therefore know that the laws of nature can't be violated, so therefore miracles can't happen. That's a circular argument, right? Because you're assuming what? You're assuming your conclusion, right? You've already assumed it. Well, yeah, just by definition, if miracles are a violation of the laws of nature and they can't be violated, well, then by definition, what can't possibly ever happen? A miracle. But that's the argument, right? That's what you're trying to figure out. Can it happen or can it not happen? Well, if you just define it right out of existence, right out of the gate, then what can't ever happen? The miracle, right? Just like if you define God's word, if you define the Bible as God's word, if you define that as God's word, then what is it? By definition, God's word, right? So those are both bad examples. All right, let's see if we can squeeze one more. How many do we have for? We'll have to do all of these.
All right, so we've still got more left, right? That was just your classroom introduction, something that you could hopefully have fun with, kind of jump with us in the classroom there. Now, like obviously there's more, there's straw man fallacies of, called stacking the deck. One will be a straw man. That's when you don't represent your arguments or your opponent's arguments, the strongest version of your opponent's argument. You make it very easy to beat up, right? Hence a straw man is easy to beat up as opposed to a real man, right? We've, again, so many of these special pleading, you're cherry picking data, but just go through these. We've got the rest of these in your text here: poisoning the well, non sequitur. That's kind of like your catch-all, right? When you're just not sure what the fallacy may be, but you just know that what they're saying, the conclusion they're trying to draw from what they're saying, doesn't follow. It's just kind of that's non sequitur. That's non sequitur, right? Just so many here. Again, all of these are in the text there. You can go through those on your own. I won't make you hang around to continue listen to literally every single other fallacy that we have. I mean, you see, we're still going, right? There's lots of fallacies. Those first couple, right? Or first three, argumentum ad hominem, argumentum ad hominem circumstantial, genetic fallacy. Then those first, 10, 11 of those are going to be big that you're hearing constantly all the time. I'm just continuing to scroll here so that you're actually seeing how many of these fallacies there really are. So just as we say, there's just no truly exhaustive list of the ways by which people can just foul up an argument, right? There's just so many ways people can mess this up, that you can go wrong in your reasoning process. I hope that you get a lot out of this particular lecture, right? These informal fallacies, and especially going back to your book, back to the text, familiarizing yourself with the ones that we didn't necessarily get to talk to, but also the ones we did, right? Because this is what you're going to get lots of mileage out of. All right, so hopefully you got a lot out of this, guys, and I will see you next logic lecture.